Hey everybody, what's up? Do any of you have any issues with picking a certain class and race combination, looking for that certain desired build? Well, today's video is going to be about helping you pick the right class and the right race for the right job. So let's dive in. The first class I'm going to talk about is the Dragonknight, your essential damagey, tanky, kind of a good all-around class, and you can build in a lot of ways. So what races work for this class though? Well, one of the races that I picked personally was the Dark Elf. Now, the Dark Elf is great because they have a lot of synergy with a lot of the fire damage that Dragoknights do, either stamina or magicka based, but the Dark Elves get increased experience gain with dual wielding, which is, I mean, meh. That's not a real deciding factor for me, but what is you get increased maximum magicka and stamina, which would increase your damage overall depending on which you choose to build into, increased fire resistance, increased maximum magicka, and increased spell power with fire effects. And all of those work really great with a lot of Dragoknight's abilities. The Red Guard also works with Dragonknight because of his increase towards the one hand and shield skill line. You get an increase to experience with that. You also get increased stamina recovery and increased maximum stamina, and you get the little adrenaline rush ability, which restores stamina when damaging an enemy with a melee attack. So all of that will tie into a really good stamina build for the Dragonknight. Now, if you want to build a really tanky Dragonknight, like pure tank, you could go with the Orcs, which have heavy armor expertise. They can increase their maximum health and stamina, increase health regeneration, reduce sprint cost, and increase sprint speed. So this allows them to still wear heavy armor, but still be able to sprint across the battlefield faster and more efficiently than a lot of other classes. Now, aside from the Orcs, you can also pick the Imperial class if you have the DLC, because as an Imperial, you get an increased experience gain to one-handed shield, which makes you tanky, increased maximum health, increased maximum stamina, both by 12 and 10% respectively, and your melee attacks even have a small chance to restore a little bit of health on hit. So yeah, Imperial would be good if you spent the money to get it. Now, as a Dragonknight, if you didn't want to go either completely tank or do like a damagey stamina build, then if you wanted to be like a pure magic caster but with the Dragonknight's abilities, I would recommend the Breton. Because aside from the light armor affinity, you also get a large increased amount of magicka, 10%, increased spell resistance by quite a lot, and reduced magicka cost of spells by up to 3%. And this all is quite essential, especially for Dragoknights, because they just chew through magicka. And an alternative to the Breton would be the High Elf, as the High Elf would focus more on magicka recovery, as well as doing more damage with cold, fire, and shock effects. But you do get that 9% increased to magicka recovery. That would be quite nice, especially during battle. And if you want to use a Destruction Staff, you get increased experience gain with Destruction Staffs for the High Elves. So that is also a good choice. But honestly, since the Dragonknight is what I would consider a good beginner class, there are very few races that just don't work well. So you could pick almost any race with the Dark Elf, with the Dragonknight, and do just fine. But what happens if you don't want to be a Dragonknight and instead would like to be a Sorcerer? Well, the interesting thing about Sorcerers is that largely magicka builds tend to be favored with them. I feel in my own experience it would be harder to make a pure stamina based Sorcerer. I've tried something like a hybrid where I would switch between magicka and stamina. That's what my current Sorcerer is. It's kind of like a jack of all trades in a way, and I talked about it before briefly, but I think overall when it comes to endgame, I'm talking veteran level, 14 to 16, it would be better to be pure magicka or pure stamina, but really in the case of the Sorcerer, pure magicka would be the way to go. Right off the bat, the two best choices in my eyes would be the Breton, because you get the experience gain with the light armor skill line, you get increased maximum magicka, 10%, you get the increased spell resistance, which, I mean, if you're wearing light armor, you're going to have a lot of that anyway, so you'll have even more versus other sorcerers and magic users, and of course, you get reduced cost of spells by a percentage which is always great. Always love that. And if Breton isn't your thing, you could also go with the High Elf, because you get the increased experience gained with Destruction Staff skill line. You get increased magicka recovery while in combat. Now that's a big thing. That's right around the level of awesomeness as the reduced magicka cost of spells, in my opinion. You also get the increased magicka, maximum 10%, which means more damage, and increases damage with cold, fire, or shock effects, like stuff like burning and whatnot. Alternatively, if you wanted to still be Sorcerer and kind of do like a mixed build, like I was talking about, you know, a little bit of stamina stuff, a little bit of magicka stuff, you could be a Dark Elf, since these guys have experience gained with dual wield, which is, I mean, meh, in my opinion, but you get the increased magicka, maximum magicka and stamina by 6% each, so that's good. You get increased fire resistance by a fair amount, and another increased maximum magicka by another 3%, and of course increased spell power with fire effects by a small amount, all of which is useful as a sorcerer, since the sorcerer is all about magicka powered death and throwing beams of electrical balls of doom. But what about those of you who really aren't into the whole spell slinging thing, and you want to be sneaky and invisible and ruin lives as a Nightblade? Well, some of the best races for Nightblade would be the Bosmer, which is the smaller elf guys, because these guys have increased experience gain with the bow skill line, increased stamina recovery while in combat, super useful if you're a stamina based Nightblade. You also get increased poison and disease resistance, also increased maximum stamina by 3%, awesome. And finally, improved stealth radius by up to 3 meters, and increases damage done while stealthed by 9%, so this works so well into either a magicka or stamina based Nightblade, because you have... people would have to get that much closer to you to see you, and then if you attack out of stealth, or I'm sorry, while you're in stealth, that attack does 9% more damage. So, oh yeah, Bosmer is a great choice, but there are others, like the Khajiit, for example. He gets increased experience gain with medium armor, which I would, in my opinion, is ideal for stamina-based Nightblade builds. You also get an increase to health regeneration while in combat by 15% in max rank, which is, oh, that's awesome. You also get improved stealth radius by the same 3 meters, and increased damage done while stealthed by 9%, just like the Wood Elf. However, unlike the Wood Elf, you get this neat little stat called Carnage, which increases the critical rating for melee attacks by up to 6%. Now that is awesome, especially if you're a dual wielding or two-handed wielding melee stamina based Nightblade. You can also build a completely magicka based Nightblade as well, and even build him to be a vampire, utilizing all of their magicka based abilities, making you extremely deadly, because not only can you turn invisible like all the time, but if built right, you're like almost nearly unkillable, because you're just able to pop right into invisibility, and that's, in my opinion, what makes Nightblade really both overpowered and overused in my experience in PvP. It seems like a lot of people are Nightblades, but that aside, if you want to be one of those abusing invisibility Nightblades that focus on magicka, you could go with the Breton, because you get the increased maximum magicka, spell resistance, and reduced magicka cost, or you could go with the High Elf, which gives you increased magicka recovery in combat, max magicka, and more damage with cold, fire, or shock. Both of those would be excellent choices. That said, if you want to be the most effective magicka-based Nightblade, I would choose Breton, because you get the increased experience gain with light armor, which means using light armor you'll rank up faster using light armor, and light armor gives you the benefit of adding all of that maximum magicka and magicka recovery, making you you'll fling spells left and right. Plus, with the Breton, your spell resist will be pretty high, higher than most. It's just your armor that you'll have to worry about. But that's okay, because you can just go invisible. So, yeah, it's Breton all the way. And finally, we have the Templar. Now, the Templar is pretty unique, in which case you can build the Templar in almost any conceivable way. You could build him as something stamina-based, however, I feel his strengths truly are based on all of his magicka-based abilities. But that said, you can still build him to be a tank, much more so than the Sorcerer, and or you could build him to be a healer, or you could build him to be like just pure, unadulterated DPS with all of his spear abilities and all of his other abilities. And you can even throw in some healing in there just for yourself, you know, if you're feeling selfish. Now, if you want it to be like just a pure tank Templar and you didn't worry about maximum magicka or stamina, then I would recommend being the Nord. You get increased experience gain with two-handed weapons. You also get increased health regeneration while in combat. Excellent. You have increased cold resistance and increased maximum health, as well as an increased armor rating. So this just innately makes you really tanky, and that way you can focus maybe some other attributes on more tanking abilities, or even a little bit of damage or healing as a tank. So Nord is a good choice. Another good choice would be the Orcs. It's just that the Orcs have maximum stamina and maximum health. And while you may not use stamina that much, aside from like your weapon skills or maybe bow skills, Orcs increased experience gain with heavy armor and reduced sprint cost and increased sprint speed is quite nice. If you wanted to become a maximum healer Templar, then I would recommend either the High Elf or the Breton, as both of them have increased maximum magicka and the increased max recovery, whereas the Breton has the reduced magicka cost of spells. So it's kind of a toss-up between the two. Either one would work very well. Hell, you could also go Argonian, because you get an increased gain with the Restoration Staff. The increased swimming speed and effectiveness of potions is always pretty nice. And then you've got increased maximum health and disease resistance. And on top of that, you have increased healing received by up to 6%, which is awesome. And finally, if healing and tanking as a Templar isn't your thing, you can always go max damage, and of course, just like the Sorcerer and the NIghtblade, who are magicka based, the Templar is magicka based. So that being the case, I would fully, again, recommend either the Breton or the High Elf, as they are built for maximizing magicka based damage, keeping your resources up and or high for that stat, and reducing the amount that it takes to cast spells or regen. Lastly, now that I've covered all of the racial class combinations that work well, I want to talk about the races in general and which one is the best for each role. And for tanking, I would say the Nord, because you get max health, health regen, and extra armor, which is pretty much everything a tank needs, to be quite honest. And moving on to spellcasting, the High Elf, for damage-wise at least, gives the best, because you get maximum magicka, the increased regen during combat, and increased elemental damage. So, whereas the Breton is kind of more defensive-based, with the increase to spell resistance and reduced spell cost, which could be used for healing efficiencies. So definitely the High Elf for spellcasting. For melee DPS, I would say the Khajiit, because they get the increased critical chance and critical damage using melee weapons, and the extra stealth damage is, it's great. It's one of the best for melee characters in general. And if you're into archery, the Khajiit is also imperatively good and superior to the Wood Elf, because their critical bonus applies equally to bows as well as melee weapons, even though it says only physical weapons. But the bows do count, so Khajiit for archery and melee DPS. And with that, I have given you the totality of my Elder Scrolls knowledge on racial combinations with classes and all of that. So, if you enjoyed the video, please give it a like. I would really appreciate it, and it helps out. Even if you didn't enjoy the video, please give it a like. If you haven't subscribed yet, feel free to subscribe for more. I do Elder Scrolls videos like this every 2 or 3 days, with other smaller roguelike and RPG Let's Plays in between. So lots of content for you guys to enjoy. I'm going to head back in game now. I hope you guys have an excellent night, and I will catch you next time.